There is an animal that built civilization. Not a metaphor. Not a poetic exaggeration. Before the wheel was widely adopted, before bronze replaced stone, before writing systems spread across continents, the ox was already pulling the plow. Cattle gave early farmers their protein, their leather, their labor, their wealth. In many ancient cultures, they were currency. In others, they were gods. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of the modern cow, appears in some of the oldest cave paintings in human history, rendered in ochre and charcoal on cave walls in Europe with a reverence that still resonates across 40,000 years. And for a long time, we thought we understood how that wild, dangerous animal became the docile cattle that would eventually reshape every continent it touched. Then the ancient DNA arrived. And the story, the clean, confident, settled story, turned out to be wrong in ways that researchers are still working to understand. The origin of domestic cattle is not a single event in a single place. It is a collision of continents, a palimpsest of independent decisions made by separate human cultures, and a genetic record so tangled with migration, admixture, and forgotten populations that it has forced a complete rethinking of one of the most important transitions in the history of human civilization. The accepted story was built on solid foundations. Archaeologists had identified the wild aurochs, Bos primigenius, as the ancestor of all domestic cattle. That much was not in dispute. The aurochs was a formidable animal, considerably larger than any modern breed, with long curved horns and a temperament described in ancient sources as aggressive and unpredictable. Julius Caesar wrote of them in Gaul with something close to admiration. Roman hunters considered them worthy prey. To domesticate such a creature was not a trivial act. The archaeological evidence pointed toward the Near East, specifically the region known as the Fertile Crescent, encompassing parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, as the primary site of cattle domestication. Bone assemblages from sites in this region, dated to around 10,000 years before the present, showed the gradual changes in cattle morphology that accompany domestication: smaller body size, altered horn shape, the demographic shift toward younger animals in the kill record that suggests human management of herds rather than opportunistic hunting. The genetic studies of the early 2000s seemed to confirm it. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces ancestry through the maternal line, pointed toward a founding event in the Near East, with a relatively small number of founding females. Estimates suggested that modern taurine cattle, the humpless breeds that dominate European and many other global herds, descended from a founding population of perhaps no more than 80 individuals. It was a neat story. A small group of wild aurochs in the ancient Near East, tamed by Neolithic farmers, and then carried outward through the human dispersal of agriculture into Europe, Africa, and eventually the world. The story was not entirely wrong, but it was missing something enormous. The first friction appeared in the bones of African cattle. African cattle had always presented a mild puzzle. Many African breeds, including the famous Zebu-influenced breeds of East Africa and the distinctive long-horned cattle of the Sahel, showed traits that did not map cleanly onto a Near Eastern founding population. Some researchers attributed this to adaptation. Thousands of years in different climates and environments produce different-looking animals. Others pointed to the zebu, the humped cattle of South Asia, classified as a separate subspecies, as evidence of a different ancestry stream that had mixed into African herds through later trade. But there was a deeper problem. When researchers looked at the morphological evidence from North Africa, from ancient Egypt, from the Sahara, from the Nile corridor, they found cattle that appeared very early in the archaeological record. Earlier, in some cases, than the models based on Near Eastern diffusion seemed to allow. Some of the earliest depictions of cattle in African rock art came from the Sahara, from a period when the region was far more fertile than it is today. The Green Sahara, a climatic window that closed roughly 5,000 years ago and left behind a desert that buried much of its own history. Were African cattle simply descendants of Near Eastern herds carried south and west by migrating farmers? Or was something else happening? The question became more pressing as the ancient DNA evidence began to accumulate. Genomics entered the cattle origin debate in earnest through the 2010s, As ancient DNA technology became sophisticated enough to extract and sequence genetic material from thousands of years old bones, teeth, and even fragments preserved in cave sediments. The tools were the same ones revolutionizing the study of human prehistory, whole genome sequencing capable of reading millions of genetic markers simultaneously and comparing them against reference populations from across the globe. For cattle research, this opened a door that had been sealed for decades. Modern cattle carry the genetic imprints of thousands of years of selective breeding, trade, migration, and deliberate crossbreeding. Their genomes are layered with signals from many different ancestral populations, making it difficult to read the original pattern beneath. Ancient specimens, by contrast, carry purer signals, the genetic fingerprint of a particular time and place, before centuries of subsequent mixing had blurred the boundaries. When researchers began reading those ancient fingerprints systematically, the Near Eastern founding event remained visible. But it was no longer the only story in the genome. Something else was there, and it was pointing in an unexpected direction. The conflict that deepened through the mid-2010s was not simply about geography. It was about independence. Ancient DNA studies of African cattle, and particularly of early specimens from the Nile Valley and the Saharan Transition Zone, began to reveal a genetic profile that did not fit comfortably within the Near Eastern founding narrative. The divergence between some ancient African cattle lineages and the Near Eastern founding population appeared, under some analyses, to be too deep, too old, to be explained by simple diffusion from a single domestication event that had then spread into Africa. One interpretation was admixture, that Near Eastern domestic cattle, arriving in Africa through the Fertile Crescent Corridor, had interbred with local wild aurochs populations that still roamed North Africa at the time. Under this model, African cattle were not purely descended from Near Eastern founders but were a hybrid, partly domestic, partly local wild, and the blending had produced something genetically distinct from the source population. But another interpretation was more radical. Some researchers began to argue that the North African signal was not simply admixture. It was, potentially, evidence of an independent domestication event, a second origin point, somewhere in the Nile Valley or the Eastern Sahara, where Neolithic pastoralist cultures had independently tamed local aurochs populations around the same time, or even earlier, than the Near Eastern event. That was not a detail. That was a fundamental rewriting of the story. If this kind of evidence, the kind that quietly dismantles what seemed settled, is the kind of history that holds your attention, subscribe. There is far more of it buried in the ancient record. 3 major frameworks now compete to explain what the ancient DNA has revealed, and the debate is ongoing. The first holds that cattle were domesticated once, in the Near East, and that subsequent admixture with wild African aurochs populations, animals that were still widespread in North Africa during the early Holocene, produced the genetic divergence seen in ancient African specimens. Under this model, Africa received domestic cattle from the Near East and then locally modified them through crossing with wild animals, creating a hybrid population that carried both Near Eastern domestic ancestry and local wild ancestry. The distinctiveness of African cattle is real, but it is the product of contact, not independent origin. The second framework proposes a dual domestication, with one founding event in the Near East producing taurine cattle and a separate, independent founding event somewhere in the Indian subcontinent producing zebu cattle. This duality is now widely accepted. The genetic divergence between taurine and zebu lineages is deep enough that most researchers consider them independently domesticated. But the framework raises the question of where Africa fits, as a recipient of both lineages, a zone of convergence, or something more complex still. The third and most contested framework suggests a third, partially independent domestication event in Africa itself, likely in the region of the Nile Valley or the Eastern Sahara, where the intersection of wild aurochs populations, early pastoralist cultures, and a favorable climate may have produced a domestication process that was at least partly independent of the Near Eastern one. Under this model, African cattle are not simply the children of Near Eastern herds. They are something older and more original, a regional response to the same Neolithic pressures that were producing domestication events across the connected ancient world. No framework has yet swept the others aside. The ancient DNA is still accumulating. The question remains genuinely open. The study that most forcefully reoriented the field was published by an international team drawing on ancient cattle specimens from sites spanning the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Corridor, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. What distinguished this analysis was the breadth of its ancient comparison panel, specimens from dozens of sites, covering a time range from the early Neolithic to the Bronze Age, combined with whole genome sequencing rather than the more limited mitochondrial analysis that earlier studies had relied on. The findings confirmed what earlier researchers had suspected, that the genetic architecture of ancient African cattle was not fully explained by Near Eastern descent alone. There was a signal in the ancient African genomes that pointed toward a source population distinct from the Fertile Crescent founders, a signal consistent with introgression from North African wild aurochs, or from a founding population that had itself diverged from the Near Eastern lineage before fully domesticated traits had spread through the population. The team stopped short of declaring a third independent domestication event. The evidence, they noted carefully, was consistent with multiple interpretations. But they emphasized that the old simple model, cattle domesticated once in the Near East, then carried everywhere else, was no longer sufficient to explain what the genomes showed. The story did not collapse. It widened. The twist that cuts deepest is not about Africa alone. When researchers began mapping the spread of cattle through Europe, tracing the genetic signatures of ancient cattle bones found in Neolithic farming sites from Anatolia to the British Isles, they found something that the diffusion model had not predicted. As cattle moved west and north through Europe with the spreading Neolithic farmers, they encountered populations of wild European aurochs that were still present, still widespread, and still reproductively compatible with their domestic relatives. And the breeding happened. Ancient European cattle genomes carry signatures of introgression, genetic material absorbed from local wild aurochs populations, that accumulates as you move further west and north through the continent. Early Anatolian cattle, closest to the Near Eastern founding population, show relatively little of this wild signal. Later specimens from Central and Northern Europe show progressively more. The genome reveals a pattern of repeated, local admixture, domestic cattle arriving in a new region, encountering wild aurochs, and producing offspring that were genetically somewhere between the two. The domestic cow, the animal that appears so settled and so ancient in the European landscape, was not a fixed import. It was a hybrid that kept remaking itself, absorbing the wildness of the land it moved into, carrying in its genome the memory of every aurochs population it met along the way. Not a single stream flowing outward from one source. River system, branching, merging, absorbing, transforming. What the cattle genome ultimately reveals is a principle that appears, again and again, whenever ancient DNA is applied to the domestication question. The clean single-origin model, the founding event, the spread, the transformation, consistently underestimates the complexity of what actually happened. Domestication, in every case studied with sufficient genomic resolution, turns out to have been messier, more distributed, and more entangled with local wild populations than any tidy narrative allows. This matters beyond the specific case of cattle, because cattle were not incidental to human civilization. They were structural. The expansion of Neolithic farming into Europe was carried in part by the cattle economy. The pastoral cultures of Africa that shaped the continent's history for millennia were built around their herds. The wealth systems, the religious systems, the ecological transformations of every region where cattle spread, all of it was downstream of the domestication event that we thought we understood and are only now beginning to see clearly. To understand where cattle really came from is, in a real sense, to understand something about the shape of civilization itself. Picture the Eastern Sahara 6,000 years ago. The landscape is nothing like the desert it will become. Shallow lakes reflect a sky full of cloud. Grasses stretch in every direction. Acacia trees line the watercourses. And moving slowly through the heat of midday, a small herd of cattle, not yet the sleek, managed breeds of later centuries, but rougher, taller, more horn and muscle than later domestication would allow, follows a group of pastoralists across the open ground. The people know these animals. They have known them for generations. They read the posture of each individual animal the way a navigator reads wind. They know which cows will accept the milking, which bulls are calm enough to lead, which calves will be slaughtered and which will be kept for the herd's future. This is not the moment of domestication that is thousands of years behind them. This is the moment of mastery, when the knowledge has settled deep into culture, language, ritual, identity. And somewhere in the genome of every cow alive today, something of that landscape persists. The grasslands that became a desert, the lakes that dried, the people who built their entire world around an animal that was itself still partly wild. The genome preserved what the Saharan sand buried. The origin of cattle is still being written. New ancient specimens are analyzed every year. New sites are excavated in regions whose contribution to the domestication story has been underestimated. The African record, in particular, remains incomplete. There are vast stretches of the continent where ancient DNA research has barely begun, and where the bones that exist in museum collections have not yet been subjected to the full power of whole genome sequencing. What we know now is already more complex than what we thought we knew 20 years ago. There was a Near Eastern founding event. It was real, and it was enormously consequential. But it was not the whole story. Africa contributed something to the cattle genome that was not simply received from the Fertile Crescent. Europe's wild aurochs left their mark on every continental breed that spread across that landscape. And the zebu of South Asia represent an independent domestication event that merged, over millennia of trade and migration, with the taurine lineage to produce the genetically complex, globally distributed animal we call cattle today. The story did not begin in one place, in one moment, with one group of Neolithic farmers who made a single fateful decision. It began in several places over several thousand years, among several cultures who each arrived, by their own paths, at the same improbable relationship with an animal that was, by any reasonable measure, far too large and far too dangerous to live beside. And yet it did. And the world was changed because of it. The genome did not simplify that story. It revealed just how wide it always was. Subscribe if you want more stories from the deep archive, the ones the textbooks haven't caught up with yet.